And we are back.
We are back, guys.
Welcome, everybody, to Metal Mastermind. Thank you to everyone who joined last week. What did we talk about last week, Jay?
So last week, man, you asked the old guy what we talked about last
I
week.
gotta test your
last
memory,
week
man.
we
Keep you sharp.
last week we talked about age. And it was so it was so much engagement. And thank all of you guys who were on last week, by the way. But yeah, we're just talking about, are you too old to pursue a music career? Because it's one of those things, playing music and we kind of perceive that as, well, I'm a guitar player, it's just a hobby, which is fine. But a lot of things, like anything having to do with your passion, people tend to think that, well, okay, I can do my passion for fun, but I've got to just do a regular job for money. And we debunked that myth in
Yes.
many ways. So, we gave you guys just really some good wholesome advice to follow and some paths that, and that's what we're all about anyway, right, Ken? We're all about really helping you push your music to that next level. For
Yeah,
those of
man.
you who, which I imagine all of you watch and want to do something with it at some point. It may be you want to play music for a living, whether it's live or recording, or maybe you just want to put something out there, just to get something out there in your name. That's your legacy. It's like, hey, I've got a song I've written. So that's why we're here.
And it make great point because age is not a real factor into making great music, right?
Right.
You,
Yeah.
actually, I think getting older, you get better taste in music. You're just more. You've absorbed more information over the course of the years, and you've diversified over that time. So,
Absolutely.
what are we going to talk about today? Well, today is our basic studio necessities. Okay, so what do you
Yes.
actually need versus what's really just a luxury. And that's a huge thing that people get caught up with when we're talking about this kind of stuff. Mainly because there's so much stuff out there, it can be hard to really decide what do you actually want versus what do you need to make stuff happen. Okay, so stay tuned because there is an awesome free PDF for you guys, or free booklet that we've both made together. And it's essentially a guide, a quick guide to the ultimate home studio. Okay? So stay tuned for that. There's some really juicy stuff. We're going to talk about some of that stuff in this video today. Okay? So, Jay, what are some of our basic necessities? What do we usually think about when we say, hey, I need a studio, right? And what are some of those things that we need in a studio like today?
So there's just a few components, and I want to simplify this as much as I possibly can, because here's this stuff can get overwhelming. And I personally, as an independent musician, and Ken, I know you probably get these too. I get questions like on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, depending on what video I just released. But just questions about, man, I want to do this, but this recording stuff's just overwhelming. I don't even know where to start. So here's the basic necessities, guys. I'm just going to run through this real quickly. So obviously you need a computer, and we'll get into, like, what type and all that here. You need a computer. Of course, you've got to have some kind of recording software to go with that computer. So those two go hand in hand. Now, another third component that ties right in directly with that is an audio interface. So for the newbies out there, okay, you've got your computer, you've got your software in your computer, but now you have to have something to connect your instrument and record your instrument with. That's what that little interface is. It's a little box. You plug your instrument into that box, then that box is plugged into your computer, and then that works with your software so that you can record music with. And I know that was a very basic explanation, but we may have some new folks on. You need some sort of listening source, whether it be headphones or studio monitors. I know a lot of guys in the beginning, they maybe don't have the budget for monitors, and we can go over some budget monitors as well. But maybe they just get a pair of headphones, because headphones are a little bit more affordable, and that's okay for
Absolutely.
starting out.
Absolutely.
And then you've got like mics and your instruments and some basic treatment and stuff like that. Um, Ken, do you want to talk about computer real quick? Like what, I know like I've got an iMac, but I started out on just a basic Toshiba laptop, and that did a great job as well. So, what are some things you recommend, dude?
So this is a great topic because the computer, you got to look at it as the heart of everything that's in your studio. Especially, we're not in an analog age anymore, where really it all depended on the quality of your analog components, right? So rather than spending, a lot of money nowadays on components like, mic pre's and consoles and all this stuff, right? That has largely been reduced to the size of the computer. The computer can do so many things that we can only dream of having in analog format, right? So you got to think of the computer as the best investment to your studio. And you were talking about, let's mention actually some types of computers.
Yeah.
Well, for let me talk about software. Like OS, right? What is OS?
Mhm.
Operating system, right? So operating systems that are usually found in studios. First one primarily, Apple Macintosh. Okay. Now, that's mostly because Macintosh has been the cornerstone in music production and any type of production for a long time. So, just by familiarity within the industry, we've kind of gravitated towards Apple computers, and that's just how it's been, right? So, the second thing, though, is people absolutely use Windows. Windows is a very capable OS to do this. Some people prefer it over Mac OS, right? Sometimes, the argument is, well, I could customize Windows a lot more than I can do Apple, and that's true. And actually, myself, I have a Windows computer, but I've installed Mac OS on one of the hard drives, and we call that Hackintosh. So I'm
That's
using
way over my head, by the way.
it's essentially you've coded the hard drive to kind of read it as a Macintosh, and all Macintosh is really is just basically software. So you tell how the software is supposed to look at certain components. And yes, that's a little more of a techie thing. So we're not going to get too much into the Hackintosh realm. Although that is an option, right? Where people like to blend the two, right? So what you can do is have a Mac, and there's a thing called Boot Camp where you can also run Windows on that. So essentially, the difference between a Mac running Windows and a Windows running a Mac is just the hardware. And essentially, it's like, okay, do you prefer to have Windows hardware or you prefer to have Macintosh hardware, right? So yeah, with a Hackintosh, I always felt like, well, I could always be more customizable because I have the Windows components that are much easily accessible, right? But then you have the software, which I'm more familiar with when working in, Pro Tools or Logic or that stuff, right? So the third one is Linux. Now, Linux is a very rare program to really see in studios. Some people really like to
Yeah.
do it because it's very good with something called Max MSP, which is like if you're doing integrations with like installations. Linux can be a very good format for that. But if you're not really working in that so much, there's also a lot of compatibility issues. People don't really work with that software OS, so it's you know kind of a tricky thing when you're going from studio to studio. So really, if you wanted to have the one that's the most compatible, right, go with Mac, right? And if you wanted to have something that was, of course, this is up to you as to how comfortable are you with the operating system that you work on. If you want something that you prefer to, let's say you value gaming also, right? You don't want to just have one computer just for one thing. Most people have computers do multiple things. Windows could be a very good option for that. People really like to game, and that's a good thing on Windows, right? So you have to have that balance of what do you value mostly in your computer, right? So the second thing about computers, okay, that when you go shopping for one, the first thing you want to make sure is if one, are you building the computer or are you buying it pre-made, right? The second thing in this category, after you're looking at the OS, look for the type of input and outputs that are going to be on your computer, right? So,
Oh yeah,
do you
yeah.
have USB 3.1 ports? Do you have Thunderbolt, right? These are things that you want to make sure that are attached to the motherboard, right? Motherboards, some people they forget that motherboards are probably the most important thing on the computer because without the motherboard, you can't connect anything to the computer. Okay, so it's like your highway. So if you wanna have a lot of lanes on that highway, right? You gotta think about that, right? So how are you connecting your devices to the computer? That's a huge portion of this. From that, we got to talk about the processor. Okay. Now,
Yeah, the processor, yeah.
Jason,
Whew,
what
that's a
kind?
lot of info, man.
You said
It's
you
good
said
though.
you're running an iMac, right?
I run an iMac, yeah. It's I've got and I know we're going to talk about RAM as well, but I've got the iMac. I bought it late 2013, um, and then it's got 8 gigs. I'm sorry, 16 gigs of RAM. This particular Mac has 4 RAM slots, and right now I've got an 8 in 2 of those slots. So, but the processor, I've got the i7. I've got the Intel i7 processor in mine.
Excellent. That's great. Because so many people always ask, oh, doesn't RAM speed up the computer, right? Wouldn't
Yeah.
just adding more RAM speed that up? No, actually, it's quite the opposite. RAM is in a way no different than, let's say, like a hard drive. Okay, all RAM does is temporarily store information. The difference is that that information can be accessed faster than storage. Okay,
Hmm.
so what the way a computer works is that you have data on a hard drive. That data is permanently written and it needs to be read by the computer in some way, shape, or form. So what the computer does is it takes that information in your hard drive and it loads it into RAM, right? And then from RAM, it's going to access that information into the CPU's cache. Okay? So there's several layers of storage in this scenario, okay? The smallest amount of storage that you get is cache, okay? The CPU is basically only going to, take a bite-size amount of information to be processing immediately, right? That rest of that information is going to be offloaded from RAM. So when you're done with the cache, it's going to say, okay, give me more information. That's RAM. That's going to give that information. And then when you're still working on something that's off a hard drive, right? RAM is going to ask the hard drive, give me more information. Okay? So it's just basically like a game of telephone, right? And the CPU is doing all of that algorithmic stuff, right? But that's where all the processing happens, okay? So the more powerful that you have of a CPU, the more processes you can do, right? Therefore, right, you don't necessarily want to cheap out on just the
Hmm.
processor, right? Because the moment you do
That's
that, you
true.
kind of handicap everything else that comes down
Yeah.
the pipeline, right? So we talked about the motherboard, then we have the CPU, okay?
Yeah.
The next thing that comes after that, what do you think, Jason? What do you think comes after the CPU? If we're
I
talking
guess
about
it'd be our RAM at that point, right? Because you
right,
said that's, and I used to think that way too, Ken. I used to think, well, man, my computer's kind of slow because I'm trying to multitask. I've got iMovie running and I've got this thing over here running, and then I need more RAM. But like you said, not this particular computer, just computers in the past. This one is okay. But yeah, so and what I wanted to ask too, Ken, is like all this that we're talking about here, having a really decent computer. How does this relate though to our software? And do different recording software programs take up more space, so to speak? You know what I mean? Or do different software recording programs require more processing power RAM than others? Like, for example, and I'm kind of going into the software here, like Reaper. Reaper is probably one of the most affordable recording software programs you can have. If we're talking budget, when you get into things like Pro Tools, I use PreSonus Studio One. I'm a huge, that's all I've used though, so but I'm very comfortable with it. Uh, and that's not super expensive, but how does that, I guess, correlate? How does the computer correlate with the different types of software that's out there?
Well, that's a great question because the program is going to demand of the processor whatever the program's minimum requirements are. So that's not going to change from processor to processor. What will change is how much the processor can do at once.
Hmm.
So, for example, we're talking about, let's say, a multi-track session in Pro Tools or Logic or Reaper. Right? Reaper, by the way, is free, so it's the most affordable.
Oh, it's still free. Wow,
It's still
dude.
free. Still
Wow.
free. I
I
mean, they
didn't know
always
that.
do this thing where it's like a donation thing, so you could still, say like you're still evaluating the program if you want to just keep doing that. So, but yeah, essentially it's free. You can, and then you can choose to buy the program to support the cause, which absolutely you should if you use it.
Good calls, yeah.
But the computer basically has something called clock speed. And clock speed is how fast is the computer reading the data. Okay. And they usually have this in terms of gigahertz, which is like uh, basically billion, a billion times per second. Okay. And hertz is just the frequency of that information. So 1 billion, at least 1 billion revolutions per second of data, which is
One
crazy, you
billion.
know? Exactly. Or 1 million, right?
Yeah.
No, you idiot. um, so when the clock speed is faster on a processor, you're able to do more calculations per second. Basically, when it comes to music, this is a really important detail, and people forget this because people kind of confuse having more cores with clock speed. Because
Okay.
more cores, right? When you talk about like 8 core, 6 core, 4 core, quad core,
We're not
right?
talking about metalcore, right? Not
No,
metalcore. We're talking about
this
computer core.
this ain't grindcore. This ain't
Yeah.
metalcore.
Yeah.
So, although it's made out of metal, so this is
That's a good point. Yeah.
this is a really, really tricky thing that people get confused with all the time because that core clock is saying how many times are we processing this data per second. And here's the thing: when you're
Hmm.
working with music, okay, a lot of that information is in series. What do I mean by in series? In series means that it comes one after another. So, for example, your plugin chains, right? You have
Wow. Yeah.
an EQ, a compressor, an effect, right? It needs to process that information in order, right? So that becomes a very highly intensive part of processing data at that time. So if you have faster clock speed, you can process that data faster, thus you can have less latency. Okay? Latency
Like
meaning
Acoustic said, right? Acoustic basically said in their faster processor, the less latency you
yes,
have.
exactly right. So because you're doing those things in order, and that's how music production works. When it comes to video, right? If you're doing video, it is better to have more cores because then you can
Yeah.
do multiple different processes at once, right?
Yeah.
And then we'll get to video cards later. So it's much more significant to have, let's say, a 6 core processor with 2.7 gigahertz rather than an 8 core processor with 2.1, right?
Oh,
Because
gotcha.
you're
Okay.
not
No,
taking advantage of that power that you
gotcha.
really need. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. Now, Faceless, he's got his comment on there. He's got a 4-core i5, 512 gigabytes SSD, 16 gigs of RAM. Says that's plenty of fast, and that sounds kind of like a really nice scenario for recording. But I guess when you add multiple tracks, especially with plugins, some plugins I've noticed will kind of, use up more CPU, I guess, in that sense than other plugins. And I think the companies creating those plugins have gotten better about it. But, we do live in a different world. I mean, just probably 10, 12 years ago, yeah, we were in the digital recording world, the software world, but we were either still miking amps or we were using things like the Pod HD 500, for example, where you just plug that directly into your interface. There you go. It's not using hardly any CPU power because your amps are in that unit. And I think Apollo can, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Apollo products, they actually use the power in the actual device itself. Maybe the
Exactly.
interface. I'm not really sure how that works.
So let's talk about this
Faceless,
for a
you're right.
second.
Neural DSP dips that takes more power.
Yes, that's let's talk about that for a second, because some of the, and it's not just Universal Audio. We're also, other companies like Analog, even Avid,
Mm,
that makes Pro Tools. Uh,
mhm.
that's one of the selling points about getting a Pro Tools HD system, where you
Wow.
you install that card. And of course, this is mostly in that professional scenario, because I mean, like, their
Yeah.
cards are like $5,000. So this is not anywhere near in like home studio budget, right? So you get one of those cards though, and you have extra chips that are working on processing what's happening in Pro Tools, so that there's less strain on your processor, right? So similar with Universal Audio, you get those DSP functionalities, right? You connect the device via Thunderbolt, right? So you get 40 gigabits per second back and forth between the computer and the device. And you can have that information being processed whenever you use Universal Audio plugins, and it'll be on the Apollo and not on the CPU. So an i5 is bare minimum for what you really need in this sort of scenario. I don't necessarily recommend an i5. I think an i5 would be good for maybe some basic tracking, but beyond like doing heavy mixing, especially if you're trying to do more mixing or do a lot of virtual instruments, this type of stuff will be very taxing on the processor. So if you're just doing some simple recordings, it could be either like from anywhere, anything from an acoustics to, recording a simple band setup. An i5 can do the job, no doubt about it. But as you start tacking on more plugins or more processing, it's going to not go as far as, let's say, an i7 would in the marathon race. Okay, so for example, that first block, they're both the same. Yeah, but then as you keep going forward, that i5 is going to start running out of breath, as before the i7 will, right? And then of course, you can talk about any of the other processors that have come out nowadays, like Threadripper from AMD, and those are workhorses, right? They go for miles. But yes, this is, if you're working with a simple setup, Faceless, you said you record mostly 4 guitar tracks. This is
Yeah.
plenty fine, you
That's
know,
plenty. Yeah.
plenty fine, right? I personally recommend a terabyte of data on a hard drive,
Mhm.
so that you're not storing everything on that 512. That's going to eat up all that data pretty quick. I usually, if you have that, I would get an external hard drive to store your data. But we're going to get to hard drives in a minute. What we were talking about, or we were on to, you said we were talking about RAM, okay? So here's the thing. RAM, you can buy different types of speed for RAM, okay? But I don't want anybody here to think that a faster stick of RAM is going to do that much more for you, because
Mm.
quite honestly, it's not. A lot of it is mostly for overclocking, um, like competitions and stuff like that. Uh, Getting faster RAM isn't is maybe that 1%. It's not justifiable to get, let's say, 3600 megahertz of RAM versus 2666, right, of megahertz, right? That is, by the way, usually the standard with like Apple computers, like 2666 megahertz. So when you're shopping for RAM, you got to make sure that you're buying the same spec that's supposed to go in your machine. And there's
Yeah.
other things like ECC. What's ECC? And it's mostly like security protocols on RAM to make sure that it's server grade, that sort of thing. So the most important thing is that when you're trying to upgrade your RAM, which is a great thing to do, especially if you're using a lot of virtual instruments,
Yeah.
okay? I work with a lot of virtual instruments. I work with symphonic sounds, right? So
That's a
I
ton, right?
I have to load all that information into RAM from my hard drive, right? I have my sample library in my hard drive, but then it gets loaded into RAM so that I could use it with my session, right? So that information, if I have a lot of things going on in my project, I need a lot of RAM so that I could work with it without hiccups, right? So you get more RAM so you can have a little bit more flexibility in that front, right? So that's where RAM counts, but not necessarily the speed. So yes,
Okay.
more RAM could be beneficial, especially if you're working with virtual instruments or synthesizers and this sort of thing. That will help to put less strain on the RAM sticks on trying to get so much data on board. Uh, but really, all that processing is still happening at the CPU level, right? Again, everything has to run through that CPU. That's where everything gets centralized, right? That's why they call it the central processing unit. Okay, so having good RAM enough RAM, I recommend something like 32 gigs, right?
Thirty.
If you can get
Okay.
it, if you're working a lot with virtual instruments. 16 gigs is the minimum that Pro Tools requires. So
Hmm.
that's totally fine if you're working with recording and you're using like just guitars or stuff like that. Then you're in a good ballpark. And 16 gigs can get you pretty far in most cases. Um, but like I said, if you're doing extra processing with virtual instruments, you might be interested in more RAM.
So I think one of the takeaways as far as computer goes, and we're going to get into some other meat and potatoes here, guys. But as far as the computer goes, you, two things you have to assess. One is your budget, obviously, right? That's one thing you have to assess because computers can get expensive. But really, I guess the first thing you would want to assess is what are you actually using it for? Like, what kind of music are you recording? Of course, most of you are metal musicians, but maybe you are doing some symphonic metal and you're using some virtual instruments that would take up a lot of space. But if you're not, let's say, like most of my solo stuff, for example, it's just guitar. And actually, I'm going to be recording with just an amp, which miking an amp takes, no usage at all, but I will be using some plugins. So if you're in that arena where maybe you have 3 to 4 tracks using plugins and that's it, um, you're okay. Like something like what Faceless mentioned earlier, he put his specs up there, and something like what I have, is probably perfect for that. But like Ken said, if you're using virtual instruments, so you really have to assess like what are you recording and kind of let that determine, based on your budget, what kind of computer you get. But I think Ken made a good point earlier in the beginning of all this when he said it's not something you want to cheap out on, you know what I mean? Because it's kind of going to be the heart and soul of your studio.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like price versus cost, right? If you buy something that's cheap now, you might have to upgrade next year or in
Mm,
2 years, right? So you
that's
have to
true. Yeah.
buy another one. Rather, if you just upfront spent maybe just a little more just to get a better quality one, it's going to
Right.
last you maybe double, maybe even longer than if you had to buy it again at another time down the road.
Much
So you
cheaper in the
gotta
long
you gotta
run.
look at it like an investment, right? I don't want to be changing my computer every 2 years like I do my phone. That's just not something I'm
No,
interested
dude,
in.
that's so horrible that we have to do that.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
somebody mentioned about the Mac Pro, faceless. You mentioned about the Mac Pro. Yeah, fully specced out. Yeah, it's a monster of a computer. It's at 60,000 like euro or dollars or something of that sort.
Dude,
Like that's not for the home studio. It's clearly
no.
not meant for the
That's
home
movie
studio.
production. That's full on probably
That
like,
yeah, that's like Hollywood studio budget level, right? So something we're not going to even touch, right? And I don't really,
yeah.
honestly, you don't need that Mac Pro. You don't. You don't. You could get by with an iMac that has an i7 in it, right? And
Yeah,
have
that's what I've got.
some external additions to that, right?
Yeah.
Which is the thing, right? You get the thing that if you're going to buy like an iMac, right? You want to make sure that you get the right processor. That's the most important thing. The RAM, you can upgrade that later. That's the beautiful thing about the iMac. You can upgrade it later. But here's something that I see that is very interesting. Acoustic that you mentioned.
Yeah.
If I have dual monitors, does that do more on my CPU? And the question is not really, because that is
Hmm.
not the job of the CPU. That is the job of the GPU, our graphics processing unit. So this is where
Yeah.
video cards come into play, right? So let me just put this into perspective for a second. The CPU, if you're playing, let's say, like a video game, right? The CPU, what it's going to do is build the three-dimensional world for you, okay? How that looks on your screen is the job of the GPU, okay? So is it going to have ray tracing where you have all this lighting effects that are like high quality, high definition, or is it going to be very basic and limited to 1080p instead of 4K, right? That's the GPU side of things, right? So the CPU, again, takes care of the processing of what's happening in that environment, but the GPU is how you're actually seeing that, okay? So for the instance of music production, right? GPUs are not that important. So you can get by with a simple GPU. You don't really need anything fancy. If you're going to do some video work, that's where it becomes more of a thing. And just as a, pointer, pro tip, right? I think like 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which is video RAM, on your GPU is plenty. You don't need more than that. That's like, honestly, it's probably even a little overkill. So,
Cool
eight.
band, by the way.
Yeah, I love overkill.
Hey,
Absolutely.
I love them too, man.
Yeah. So we have the GPU. You can kind of let that be something for later, unless you're into like entertainment and you want the better graphics and stuff like that. That's a different story, right? So if that's a priority to you, then you can make a judgment call on that. But talking about iMacs, right? There's a built-in GPU already. So for music production, that's all you need. But if you wanted something more powerful, they actually have external chassis for GPUs. So you could actually buy a separate GPU, plug it in via Thunderbolt to your iMac, and you have the power of that GPU at your disposal, which is great. So if you wanted that extra horsepower and you just needed to plug it in for that session one day, or you wanted to, work off of that, that's something you could do. You can easily add that, right? So in that way, you're almost getting the desktop power on the GPU side of things just by doing that without even having to get a desktop. And last but not least, I want to mention storage, okay? Because here's the thing.
Storage, yes.
If you don't walk away learning anything, or you've known everything that I've just talked about, here's one thing you should walk away with, is that your data does not exist unless it's in 3 places, okay? This is going to save your ass in so many ways. It saved my ass on too many accounts, okay? Back up your data. Everything that you do, back it up. You save a file, you're done for that file for the day, copy that data onto 2 other hard drives. Okay? I am such a Nazi about this thing, because it's just, you got to make sure, like, I have been working on, for example, I've been working on my album for over 4 years, man. I am not
Yeah, dude.
going to lose that information. I'm going to back that mother up, So
That would suck to lose all that. Oh my God, that would suck. Dude.
exactly. So I've got that data in at least 3 places, but really I actually have it like in 4 or 5, right? So I have constantly been on top of that, right? And that's just a habit you got to build, right? Someone might say, okay, what about RAID? What's a RAID? A RAID system is essentially when you configure 2 or more hard drives to do the backup automatically, right?
Oh.
So interesting stuff, a little more techie on that stuff, but it's not the resort that you should keep, okay? Because that information is all in one spot. So what you want to do is have at least one of those copies offsite. Offsite meaning just not in the computer, right? So if you have a hard drive inside the computer, right, you can have like different folders in your computer backing up that data, right? But if that hard drive fails, all of those backups are gone too, So you want to have different hard drives outside of the computer just backing up data too, okay? That's something I really am a fan of. So um, you should work off sort of a solid state drive, right? Just so that you're having the speed to have that instantaneous feedback from the computer, right? It's important for that. But then if you want to just save money on the backups, just get regular hard disk drives. You know, you can have 10 terabyte, 16 terabyte drives out there that cost like, you know, less than 200 bucks. I don't know. It hard drive disks are not that expensive now as opposed to what they were back in the day. Solid state drives and M.2 drives, those are all flash storage. So yes, there's going to be a little bit more expense on that. But the other stuff, the more legacy type of formats, all you need it is just for the storage space. So if you're not working off the drive and you're just using it for backup, why get a solid state? You don't need the solid state for that. You know? So
What about cloud, Ken? Do you store anything on the cloud? Like, Faceless was asking about online storage because, I guess with the hard drives, you could have 5 hard drives, but God forbid, you get broken into or fire or water damage or something like that destroys everything.
yeah.
Do you use any kind of cloud storage for your
That's a
files?
great question because cloud storage is still a thing that's people are kind of shy about because
Hmm.
it's online, right? So the question about that really is how much do you value the privacy of what you're working with? So if somebody hacks into that, you know, you're exposed on that front, right? So
Right, right.
you gotta make sure that you're on top of the security with that information. Um,
Gotcha.
Another solution, if you don't want that, is you could have an off-site. Maybe it's at a friend's house or whatever, or maybe it's at your parents if they're still around, or at your kid's place. Is having something called a network attached storage. So you could literally
Gotcha.
have your own personal online storage, where it's still a physical hard drive that is just not in the home, and you can have that
Gotcha.
online, and you are the only one that can access that instead of like putting it, let's say, on Google Drive, which is totally fine. If you wish to do that, that's another backup, right? But again, that's up to you as far as whether you prefer the security of having only you being able to access the drive, or you can have remote access from anywhere. But then the downside is that, well, if anybody online gets access to that, then it's out there
Mm.
too, right?
I
So
was thinking iCloud. If you're an Apple user, iCloud, I don't know. I mean, Google, I'm sure is secure, but like you said, people can hack into it. I would think that your Apple account, if you're an Apple user, of course, the iCloud, that Apple ID might be a little bit more difficult to hack into than Google. I could be wrong. I don't know,
right,
but
yeah,
it's just options. There's multiple options out there for you guys to do
and you
that
also
though.
got to think about one other thing is that it's a continuous cost by using cloud. So
That's true. Yeah. Yeah.
if you're going to back up to Google Drive, I mean, you can get up to like a terabyte, I think, for like $2 a month. But if you want
Yeah.
anything more
Still
than
paying.
that, then you're probably going to spend maybe up to $10 a month. Same thing with Dropbox. Same thing with iCloud. So that's an additional factor that you have to think about. So that's totally up to you.
Yeah.
But enough about computers. We've talked so much about the computers because I mean this is like it's
Yeah.
really really important. But I want to really
It is. Yeah.
emphasize that because this is your center, right? It really is. Um, but let's talk about recording software. So Jason, you were mentioning Studio One. Why did you choose Studio One? And why have you stayed with Studio One?
It's easy to use. Here's the thing. Hi, Timbo. Tim, thanks for he just said hi, guys. Want to make sure that we knew he was listening. But so I started out. I think I told you guys a couple episodes ago. I started out recording with software in like 2010, something like that. I had originally got Reaper because it was free at that time as well. But when I bought my interface, which we're probably get into that next, I would imagine. And I just kind of closed my eyes and picked one. They were all like these $99 interfaces, and for whatever reason, I went with the PreSonus Audio Box. So it came with their version, their artist version of the software, which is kind of watered down. I upgraded and I just stayed with it. The thing about what I'll say about this is I've never used any other recording software, so I can't even compare to anything. What I will say though is whatever you choose to use, stick with it and learn it like the back of your hand. And if you do that, and Ken, you may say, you may bring out some other points here, um, but in my opinion, if you do that, if you learn it like the back of your hand and just that's what you're going to use, then that's going to go much further than having, let's say, the greatest industry standard and not really knowing how to use it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense. And I asked you that question because I wanted to get that response because
Yeah,
it's
good, good.
not about, yeah, it's not about, you know, having to have Pro Tools because that's the industry standard, right?
Yeah,
Because that only depends whether you're actively using Pro Tools and you're going from studio to studio. That's
right.
something that I do, you know, but it may not be something that you do. So get something that you're familiar with.
Yeah,
Faceless, use GarageBand. Great. You know,
yeah,
and you said you want to use Logic. Logic is like an enhanced version of GarageBand. It makes perfect sense to do that, right?
yeah.
Because yeah, you get more functionality with Logic, and that's something that might be very enticing. And one thing about Logic is that it's a one-time payment. It's not one of those subscriptions, right? So
That's a good thing. Yeah.
yeah, and that's important to people. So
Studio One, the same thing.
yeah, you know, you get Studio One. You got to use something that you're familiar with, something that you can be
Yeah,
comfortable, that you can create content with. Because here's the thing, that technology aspect to all of this stuff can really hinder that creativity if it gets in the way, right?
it
So
can. Yeah,
if you're trying to learn a program and you've been so accustomed to one program versus that one, just use that program. Like, what's the
just use it.
problem?
Yeah,
What's the problem with using one versus another, right? You know, if it doesn't make a logical sense to upgrade, all you're doing is moving sideways. Okay?
yeah,
You got to move forward, not just sideways, okay? If you have to change lanes, it's because there was a good reason to do that. You know, whether it's like, okay, well, I got this job that now works with this program, so I have to go into that lane and start learning that program, okay? That's
yeah,
different. But if you're trying to just create something for yourself, I mean, like, use something that you're familiar with, right? And that's really all we have to say about it, because all of the recording softwares,
yeah. You're
they're the
right.
same. They really are. There's nothing really that different between the two, between them all. It's just that you know, just your workflow is what will change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just learn it, guys. Just like in the beginning, I was gonna say, well, it doesn't really matter. That's what almost came out. But I mean, at the end of the day, I don't know that it really does, to be honest with you. It's just, you have to learn it though, guys. I would say spend a lot of time, watch a lot of videos. There's several videos. There's a lot of YouTubers out there that focus on one specific platform, one specific software. So find that. And the forums, I learned a lot from Studio One just from the forums. I hit a lot of walls along the way, and I just went to the forums and went to videos and stuff, and eventually you figure it out. But it's not, if you hit a wall, it's not going to be the program. Yeah, every program's got its nuances, but usually if you hit the wall, it's just the simple fact that you don't know it yet, and you just once you learn it, you know it. Just like anything else.
Yeah, and guys, I just want to reiterate this this point. I'm putting in a link into the chat. You're going to have access. You know, you go to this information. We have a pamphlet about everything that we're talking about. Okay, it's called
Yes.
the quick guide to the ultimate home studio. Okay, so if you're liking what we're talking about here and you want to kind of dig in a little further, that pamphlet is got everything that we just covered and even a little more. Okay, so all you have to do is, I think, you just put in your email and it gets sent to you, and it's totally free. So just wanted to kind of put that out there because this is something that, you know, it's going to be hard to remember a lot of the details here. And this will be, you know, something you can access whenever you need it. So if you're looking to buy something later down the road, you can use it as a reference, and it's there for you for that reason. Now, on from recording software, I really think the next thing that's important, and Jason, I want to talk about monitors for a second,
Yeah.
because the audio interface is a super important part to all of this, and that's one of the reasons why it's even on the list. But speakers and headphones, you don't necessarily need an audio interface to use those. So if you're not at a point where you have an audio interface, I want you guys to consider how you're listening to the music that you're creating, okay? And whether that's on headphones or whether that's on speakers. And here's the difference that I want you to take away. What is consumer and what is quote unquote professional, okay? The difference between the two is that consumer electronics tend to enhance or color the music that you're listening to in a certain way. Whereas professional
Feels like
gear
that.
is meant to be very neutral. Which, if you were to compare the two, you might prefer the consumer stuff because the professional stuff is very like quote unquote bland. It's not very enticing, but it's very truthful. Okay? So if you can make something sound exciting on that type of gear, that's where it counts, right? It's not the gear, it's the ear. Okay? So you gotta trust your instincts that working on music, right? If you have that intuition as to something is starting to really come together, it's feeling good, then it's good. Okay?
Yeah.
Trust your instincts on that. And you don't need to buy something that's like $10,000, $6,000, right? You don't need those speakers. Why? Well, here's the thing, Jason. You ready for this?
I am ready, dude.
If you put speakers in a crappy sounding room, and those speakers cost $6,000, $10,000, and they're the most amazing speakers that ever existed, it ain't gonna do anything for you. It's gonna
That's expensive
sound
crap, basically, that you're listening to.
expensive crap
Yeah.
because you have nothing in the room to help the speakers to reach their full potential.
Right.
Okay, and I really I've emphasized this I think before, but like DIY is like the way to go when it comes to working on like acoustics in your room, and we're gonna get to acoustics shortly at the end. But as far as monitors and speakers go, choose ones that feel right to you. Okay, Jason, you've got KRKs,
Old KRKs,
and
like the first generation KRKs.
dude, that's totally fine because if you know how those speakers sound,
Yeah.
you can make the judgment call. Okay? And that's what's really important. It's you understanding what your room sounds like, what your speakers sound like. The moment you start changing speakers, it's like,
You start over.
yeah, you start over. You got to learn it again, right?
Yeah.
So it's something that's it's a tricky thing, you know? If like just for example, like I used to work at Masterdisc as an intern, which is a mastering studio that it's the final production of the music audio assembly line, and those guys, man, they're like, don't touch the speakers because they are
They're set right in place.
they're
Yeah.
set right in place. They're so well tuned to listening to them, on a daily basis. They know those speakers inside and out. The moment you change them, they're like, I can't work for like a whole week because I gotta just keep listening to them to see what are the ups and downs with using these other speakers, right? Very, very difficult for somebody to just, I mean, that's a professional adjusting to new speakers. So if you're unfamiliar with that kind of stuff, then the best thing that you could do is just listen to more speakers and then choose which ones you like to listen to. Okay? So, but once you have them in place, try sticking with them for a while and try
Yeah,
working
leave
with
it
them.
there.
So that's that other balance that you gotta kind of manage in that aspect.
Now, one thing, Ken, about speakers too, and it may not be feasible for you to listen to a bunch of different monitors, in a situation where you can really get used to them. So, I guess the next best thing to do is go to people that record music in your genre, which I assume all you guys are metalheads. If not, you should probably change your ways or you're going to hell. I'm just kidding, guys. No, but it's like use what people who are already successful in that realm are using. And I'm not going to try to sell you on KRKs. Again, I've been using them for so long and in the same spot for so long. My ears are used to them. So I know exactly what they I know what to expect. I know what to look for. And it kind of goes back to the same thing as recording software. Whatever you use, get used to it, know it, and learn it, use it a lot. And in that way, I almost think that you can take any monitoring system and make it work for you. You just have to mess around with it a little bit. Ken, I know we're going to talk about room treatment as well. You talked about DIY, which is great. I don't even have room treatment in my little 10 by 11 space, and 10 by 11 is a horrible space, but I've got my speakers positioned in a place where I'm used to it. I do have a chair on the other side that absorbs some of the sound, and kinda catches, as bass traps. I removed that chair for a little bit, and I noticed a difference. I'm like, "Okay, I don't like this. Chair's coming back in." So, little things like that can really help. Ken, I know at one point you talked about hanging, I don't know if it was a couple of videos ago, we talked about hanging like sweatshirts or something up to catch some of the help,
So
absorb some of that. So there's just different things you can do. I like to try to keep things budget friendly because, I don't know if we have any wealthy people on here, but it can be expensive. All this stuff can be expensive. Buying a premium computer, getting the right monitors, treatment, and all that sort of thing. So,
yeah, of course.
yeah, that's a good idea, Faceless. Wear a hat or yeah, you want me to wear a hat to avoid reflections. Yeah, it is kinda shiny though. It's very shiny today.
you make such a great point on all of that, man, because it's really about the perspective on what do you really need, right? The things that I need for my music are different from somebody else's.
Yeah,
So all we're doing is giving the information as to if you're going to go a certain way, here's something you might want to consider. If you're going to go this way, you might want to consider it with this, right? So
yeah,
you don't have to get 32 gigs, the i7 9900K processor, latest from Intel. You don't have to get, all this other jumbo mumbo. It's just, this is where you want to prioritize what you need, right? That's way better than just spending all this money on stuff that you might not even see the full potential of, right?
that's
Because
true,
if you're
yeah,
not doing video work and you get $1,000 video card, you're probably only scratching the tip of the iceberg of what that thing can do, right?
yeah.
But if you're making Hollywood movies, then yeah, that $1,000 video card might do some real work for you, right? So
It's the same with music, Ken. Like if you just plan to record your own music, then you get what caters to you. But if you're planning on to expanding your studio at some point in the near future and record other people, then you'll probably have to expand what you're getting, if that makes
absolutely.
sense.
And I want to just answer a question over here. Does the size of your speakers have to consider the size of the room? And that's a great question.
It is.
Absolutely yes. Okay. If you are playing music out of big speakers, okay, those speakers are pushing a lot of air. Okay. And what's that going to do is that it's going to enhance, or not, I don't want to say enhance, it's going to amplify the pressure in that room. Okay. And that might work against you if it's a small room. Okay.
Yeah.
Those speakers need to have room to be able to push massive amounts of air, and you need to sit farther away from those speakers to even hear them correctly. Okay. And
Yeah,
the
that's a
bigger the
very good point.
speaker that you get, the more influenced it is by the room. Because now, when you're farther away, now you're actually hearing those reflections that are within the room. Okay. But you
Yeah.
need that. So that's why mastering studios, they're usually very big rooms with very big speakers. But when you get into like mixing rooms, most of the time they're actually smaller speakers, like no bigger than like 5 inches, right?
Like
The,
those 5 inches.
like those, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. These are what we call near fields, and they're meant to push a little bit of air only to the vicinity of where you're mixing. Therefore, you're minimizing the sound of the room affecting how you listen. But you have to sit closer to the speakers. Whereas the far fields or midfields, whatever you want to call them, they're both really essentially the same category. Midfields and far fields are much further back, and you have more of that room influencing the sound of that. So therefore, you actually have to pay a lot more attention to the room and acoustics in that sense, which may be a lot more expensive in that scenario. We recommend near fields to work within the vicinity of what you're, which is what most people do anyway. They're sitting by their laptop or computer at their desk, and they're just working on their stuff, and they just have the speakers right on the desk, listening right there. Maybe the only thing that you want to consider is isolating the speakers from where they're placed, so that you have no vibrations transferring from the speakers to the surface. That's what we call coupling, and you are essentially decoupling when you isolate those speakers, so that you're actually hearing what the speaker is doing and not hearing the speaker in combination with the desk, because the desk is vibrating too. And the moment it's vibrating, guess what? It's moving air molecules, okay? And those air molecules are how we hear sound. So the moment you start hearing those vibrations, it's going to change the way how it affects your listening experience. Okay, let's see here. I bought some JBL monitors, didn't think about the bass port being on the back. Wish they were on the front. Good point. That's another thing about physics right there, right? If you start to limit the back ports, this is what we call a bass port or Helmholtz resonator. That's the technical term for it. Those are essentially, they're extending the bass response of how we hear low end in our speakers. So most of the time, they're either on the back, sometimes they're on the front, but they're essentially there so that we can hear a little bit more bottom end. And they do it with like a complicated system of tubing, and there's a whole mathematical thing behind it. I'm not going to get into that, but you need a little bit of room for that to make an effective for the speakers to be effective. You can't just back them up against the wall, because then that resonator is not pushing air around it the way it needs to. It's kind of like, think about it like an air purifier in that sense, where that air purifier needs a little bit of room to suck up the air and then put out the air that's clean. Bass ports kind of need to have room for air to be pushed out, so that you could hear that bass that's coming out of those speakers. Okay, hope that makes sense. But yes, speakers need a little bit of room around them so that they can be effective in translating the music to your ears. So let's go ahead and wow, Jason, we're at the 1 o'clock hour already.
We're at the 1 o'clock hour. Yeah, yeah, dude.
This might have to be like something that we extend into another episode, man. I don't know about you, brother.
Yeah, we may have to. Yeah, there can. I know there's one part we're going to talk about. We're going to kind of get into some like basic versus really expensive. I think that might be a conversation for another time, though, because I think we've kind of covered a lot of that anyway through here. But Ken, real quick, like I know we're going to bring up interfaces here because I mean that's something you have to have. You've got to be able to plug your instrument in, to get that signal to the recording software to your computer. Um, and I started out, like I told you guys earlier, I started out with a very cheap interface. It was $99, and there's a lot of interfaces from the $100 to $200 range. And what I would say, and I'll let Ken expand on this because he's got much more expertise in this field than I do. But what I would say is the important thing with your interface for a basic setup is making sure that it has solid preamps, and most of the interfaces out there now have that. Like PreSonus, for example, even their lower cost interfaces have what's called I think they're called the XMX or something. I can't remember the name of it, but it's some specific preamp that they're known for, and they just sound a little bit better. So, Ken, what are your thoughts on interfaces, man?
Great point about the preamps. I prefer to have, a quality preamp with a few ports. so that I
Hmm.
can capture high quality instead of just having a quantity of ports.
Yeah, yeah.
But different strokes for different folks, and you might have a situation where you need more preamps because you have more inputs. So I don't necessarily have that issue. I have, you know, a very simple setup at home. I only ever really need one or two inputs at a given time.
Same here.
What I really need more are outputs on how I'm going to, because I have surround sound and all this kind of stuff. So
Mm,
there's a couple of other factors that I'm interested in. What I recommend is that however many inputs you need, try to find something that has maybe either an extra two ports of the same, so that you are flexible with anything that comes down your way. Because I wouldn't get something that's necessarily just uh, like a one time, like, okay, now today I only, like, right now all I ever need is like a vocal and maybe a piano. But maybe down the line, you get an additional uh, amplifier, and you're just like, oh man, like, now I want to record my guitar with two different amps. And maybe that's not enough, because now you also want to do dry guitars, and you might be limited with the amount of inputs and outputs that you need for a certain situation. So I always like to think about just a little bit, just an extra port or two, just to give you some flexibility in case that you ever need to do something different, so that you're not having to be like, okay, well, either I can't do it, or I got to go and get a new
upgrade. Yeah.
item. So I always try to factor something like that into that cost. But yeah, what do you really need, um, and based on what budget? So do you need more inputs and outputs, or do you need better quality inputs and outputs? um, you know if you want better quality inputs and outputs and more inputs and outputs, then that's a price. There's a price for that. So what do you value more? Actually, I'm gonna put in the chat this wonderful video, that it's from a channel called Produce Like a Pro, and it actually has a comparison between a $1,700 setup, which is basically like a $700 mic package and $1,000 audio interface, versus a $100,000 microphone setup, which is using like a
Mm,
Neve console and professional studios, and they actually went you know head on versus the preamps that were like on this standard Focusrite. And some people actually preferred the cheaper sound versus the expensive $100,000 one. And I mean, that should tell you right there. It's like, if you're debating whether you need to buy a $3,000 piece of equipment, know that, again, it's not about the gear, it's about the ear. So if you can make it sound good because you have followed proper recording procedures, and I don't know if we're gonna get to it today, but we will absolutely talk about the golden rules of recording. Okay.
yeah.
And this is a stark difference on how you can get something sounding so good with basic things. Guys, you don't even really need like all the extra plugins, man. Like, if you know how to
Mhm.
really work a stock plugin, one, easy to transfer from studio to studio, and
Oh
two,
man.
you're
Yeah.
saving a lot of money by just using some of that stuff. It's the ear, not the gear, okay? So focus more on that. Get good at it. Spend a little bit more time practicing. Yeah, sure, that investment is your time, but
Yeah.
over the long term, you're saving yourself a good chunk of money by doing something like that. Um, I use personally in Antelope Audio Discrete 8 interface. Works for what I love to do. Highly recommend Antelope if any of you are interested in that sort of thing. It's got like DSP as well. Uh, so Jason, you have any last remarks on what you want to talk about this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, guys, is don't let this stuff overwhelm you. So again, you've got the guide there, and Ken, if you still have that copied, if you don't mind pasting that in the chat,
Sure.
we've got a free guide for you, so that will kind of walk you through. the things that we talked about today. So definitely download that. Real quick, just to we're extremely transparent with you guys. We do require your email address to get this, and that will be our main way of keeping in touch with you, to let you know when the live sessions. I've been using. I know some of you. I think most of you here are on my musician and guitar player email list for my YouTube channel, and thank you, by the way. But I want to start, since this is a separate entity from that, so we will be sending you emails through this channel. So please sign up and put us on your white list. I know Blacklist by Exodus is a cool song, but we don't want to go on your blacklist. We need to be on your white list. So just sign up there, do that. You'll get a free guide. We do not share your email with anyone. We do not spam. You guys would assume that anyway. So but real quick, guys, so one of the thing is, don't get overwhelmed by this stuff. Just kind of step back and breathe and consider what you're doing, assess what you're doing, and let the gear you get be based on that. I know a lot of you probably already have a lot of the stuff that we're talking about anyway. And if you have your recording gear there and you're using it and it works, don't even worry about upgrading to anything at this point. Like Ken just said, spend time with it listening. And what I really encourage you guys to do is record, record, record. I don't care if it's just, demo tracks or whatever, throw some fake drums in there if you need to, record some guitars. If you have a bass, throw that in, and then listen to that. And then mix, constantly mix and dump that down to an MP3 file. Go listen to it in your car, your regular headphones that's not studio headphones. Listen to it on computer, anywhere you can, to make sure it sounds good in all sources, because sometimes what sounds great in the studio may not sound good in your car, for example. And maybe you may notice a frequency there. It's like, oh crap, okay, well that doesn't sound like a monomarth. You know what I mean? So you want to dump that down and listen to it in all sources. Don't That studio is not, that's not your last stop, is what I'm saying. That's not your last stop at all. You will listen to it in other sources, and you will find changes that you need to go back into the studio and make. Well, so that's a good rule of thumb to follow. But spend time, guys. Spend time with your gear. That's the most important thing. And Ken, we're going to talk about the importance of, and this is just really a one-liner. Really, what it comes down to is your performance as well, guys. If I know all you guys play or at different levels of playing, but your performance, and that's going to come down to that, is really how good it sounds. But yeah, just spend time learning, spend time, listening and playing and recording and listening more, and just do that. And you're gonna grow. You're gonna grow exponentially as a musician, and you're gonna become your own studio engineer, which is really what a lot of you, I think, want.
Absolutely. Next time we'll talk about the golden rules of recording. We'll talk a little
Yeah.
bit more about acoustics, and if you want to do it DIY, there are great ways to do that. We'll talk about that. Guys, this is a juicy episode. We had so much to talk about in this, we couldn't even
Yeah.
fit it all in here. So it's gonna have to be another video for you guys. But we're fine with that. It makes us very excited, and we're glad that this is helping you so much. Again, that free guide is everything we've talked about, and all condensed into what, like 16 pages or something like that. So
Something like that, yeah. It's
it's a
easy to follow,
it's
though.
easy to read, easy to follow. There's pictures, so you can see exactly what we're talking about and what's important in your setup. Okay, so today was that first part. We were talking about the computer. We were talking about the interface and the
Mhm.
speakers and stuff like that. Next time we'll talk about why one mic might be better than another. What are those golden rules of recording,
Yeah.
and what is, how can we like build our own, studio absorption panels and stuff like that. It's actually a lot simpler than you may think, and it's really effective. Okay, really effective. So guys, thank you so much. We love each and every one of you. We love that you are so engaging in our videos. So stay tuned for that. We will keep you posted. All right. So, with that being said, take care. Horns up, and
Horns up, guys.
we'll see you on the next one. All right. Ciao.